The topic of financial inclusion fascinates me for two reasons. The first is that financial inclusion is a problem everywhere. In the UK, we have about 1.5 million people who are unbanked, 1.5 million adults. And in France, that's about 1.8 million people. But when you look at the problem of financial inclusion within the refugee communities, it's significantly worse, and that's because they're missing a lot of the documentation that allows financial inclusion to happen. The other thing that interests me about financial inclusion is the effect that it has. There's a concept called the poverty premium, which basically says that the poorest people in society actually end up paying more for the same services that rich people get for cheaper. So, for example, if you don't have a credit score, you can't pay your bills via direct debit, which means you've got to prepay for your energy bills, for example. And you actually end up getting put on the most expensive tariffs. Or if you're trying to get a mobile phone contract, you can't get a contract, you've got to go pay as you go, which ends up costing more. So those two concepts, I think, are really interesting. Now, we've got some panelists today, and thank you, Arnaud, for joining us as well, who we're going to explore this topic on. First of all, Tristan, I want to start with you and just talk a little bit about the specific problems in the world of finance. Monzo is a challenger bank. When someone comes to you from the refugee community and they don't have the kind of documentation, how do you onboard them to a bank?
Yeah, it's a problem we see across actually all immigrant communities, and refugees feel it the most in the UK. And so if you move to the UK, even if you just move from France and you want to start working and get a bank account and get an apartment, you can get into this problem where you can't get any of those different things. So you can't get a bank account because you don't have a proof of address. And if you go to the bank, they won't give you one. And you can't get a proof of address because you can't rent an apartment without a bank account. And so the solution for people who have moved to the UK just sort of for work is to use a friend's bank account for a few months until you build up the documentation. Now, for a refugee, that's much, much worse and much, much more difficult. The way we approach that is by going back to look at what the regulation actually asks you to do. And what we find is that most of the traditional banks, through a combination of sort of time and being very risk averse and layers of bureaucracy, have put in place lots and lots of additional requirements that aren't actually there in the regulation. And so we try to get rid of as much of those as possible. We say, for instance, you don't need to have a piece of paper proving your address that also matches up with an ID document. And so to get a Monzo bank account, you just take a photo of some form of photo ID. For refugees in the UK, that's a biometric residence permit. It could also be a passport or a driving license or something like that. And then you take a 5-second video of yourself, which is a bit weird and awkward, but seems to work quite well.
Marco, you're looking at the world of blockchain with Topos. Tell us a bit about the challenges and barriers that you're seeing at the moment.
From a technical standpoint, I would say that blockchain is very early, at the early stage. So what you see as achievable goals may be proven wrong in the next year or two. So I would say that blockchain is, at a high level, opens an incredible amount of possibilities in terms of self-identity or self-identification, empowerment and inclusion or financial inclusion. I think that in order to be safe and ship to the market something that makes sense, you need to consider blockchain as one of the elements of your venture, rather than being maximalist and just imagining a world that relies on blockchain 100%.
And for refugees specifically, what are the problems you're trying to solve?
So what we are trying to do is to create a banking infrastructure where there is no banking available, either because of let's say, lack of infrastructure, lack of legislation, lack of regulation, or simply lack of interest from financial institutions. So we are trying to set I would say, an infrastructure where people can bank themselves, and we are trying to shift the focus from financial inclusion to financial self-determination, The idea is that migrants and refugees are a huge economical force, which is driving growth everywhere they arrive. If you look at the numbers, if migrants were an economy, their net contribution to the world GDP would be the third largest. We're talking about over $6 trillion US per year. And the fact that they cannot access to a simple bank account, they cannot get a loan, probably led them to create their own informal and alternative ways to bank themselves. And now with technology, we are getting to the point where we can formalize those ways and create trust, put it on chain, so online, extending the chain of trust, which is probably the key for scalability, and allow communities to create their own banks and set up their own policies, their own values, and their own investment thesis. And this is what we are trying to do. So technically, a refugee, I would say that the first struggle that he's facing is a safe store of value, which is portable. So refugees can flee a country with everything they can grab. Sometimes money is the last thing they can grab. So allowing them to transport whatever wealth and saving they have and put it in a storage space which is safe, I think can already improve their journey. And then from that point on, obviously, you build your new life, your new endeavors, and you have a stepping stone to start.
Arnaud, with Nickel, you weren't targeting the refugee community specifically, but tell us how your bank has ended up becoming quite a powerful force of good within that community.
Yes, just to give you the quick idea of what Nickel is. So we are a payment institution, so you can open a bank into one of our 4,000 tobacconist shops in France, and you arrive with an ID card, passport, or even a resident permit. That's important. And 5 minutes later, you go out from the tobacconist shop with a MasterCard that can work and an IBAN. Nothing more. And we'll just check your address, sending you a specific letter with a code at your address. And you need to give us back through just an SMS this code. No red paper. And in less than 5 years, we've opened more than 1 million customers. 13% of them offered us a residence permit. So we can say, in 5 years, we have allowed 130,000 refugees, migrants, to become included as far as financial field is concerned in France. Because our mission is financial inclusion for everybody. We treat everybody the same way. Either you're rich, you're French, you're not French, you're poor, you're whatever. You're excluded from banks. We accept everybody. So we're very happy. It's part of our mission, receiving migrants. So we're happy to contribute to this. And using technology. And the good thing is we're using low technologies. You don't need a smartphone. You don't need to be connected to internet. You just only can use our bank using SMS and your MasterCard. And you could go to a physical point. Because one of the barriers to open an account is language. People don't understand what's happening. And we have tobacconist partnerships that are also themselves involved in inclusion. They spend a lot of time with people who are somehow at the frontier of the society. So they're happy to help them, if necessary, to fill in the form into a dedicated totem we have in the tobacconist shop, connected to internet. If you just need to print an IBAN, this is very concrete life. I'm a migrant. I will need to work in a temporary work company. They will ask me an IBAN to receive my wage. So we offer them an IBAN in 5 minutes. But later on, you need an IBAN to have your telco, to pay your telco through SDD, automatic SDDs. And then you can go to the tobacconist and he will print you for €1 an IBAN. And they love these kind of services. So we're talking about technologies for refugees. We must also think about low technologies, physical points, SMS, not only smartphone. Often when we think about technologies, we think about very high-level things, such as blockchain, smartphone, take my picture of myself. But many of our customers, many of the refugees are not that tech savvy. We think we must have the right level of technology to include them.
And one thing I like about that in particular is because you've got the physical presence, your customers can deposit cash, which I think...
It's very important for them.
Yeah.
Because as Marco said, sometimes they are the frontier of the society, so some of them live on cash. So they're very happy to deposit cash with low fees. It's only 2%. Because an alternative from what we do is prepaid cards. The advantage with prepaid cards, up to a certain level of 250 euros, you can still be anonymous. So if you do not have a residence permit, that's the only solution for you. But when you make deposits, you will pay 7% fees, first. Second, your IBAN will not be accepted for telcos to receive a wage. So it's not a real financial inclusion. Prepaid cards keep you out of the day-to-day business. So we're happy to offer a real current account with a real dedicated IBAN with low fees and the same fee for everybody.
Vinay, I want to bring you in. Tell us a little bit about what your project is doing and how it's impacting the refugee communities.
I spent from 2002 to 2014 working as a humanitarian designer, focused on shelter, failed states, digital identity, this kind of stuff. 2014, I moved to the Ethereum ecosystem, helped launch Ethereum, and now I work on a basically unrelated project about hard property rights. But my focus here is how much of this is basically regulatory. So we talk about financial inclusion, but what we really have is a set of regulations which impose much tighter regulation on the use of digital cash than on the use of paper cash. Basically creates a kind of arbitrary distinction between, as you're talking about the paper cash economy and the digital cash economy. If we're not going as far as exterminating paper cash, there has to be room for the use of anonymous digital cash in society. It doesn't make any sense that you have much higher standards for the ability to transmit money internationally than the ability for somebody to fly with it in their wallet. So although we can talk about these systems as being kind of national level solutions for people that are integrating into society, that's the last step in the refugee journey. When you begin to get failing states, the ability to stand up financial infrastructure very quickly is there. It's there technically. You've seen, for example, in Venezuela, quite a lot of use of cryptocurrency for people to keep businesses going through the difficult times. All of those systems could be much more successful and much more powerful than they are, but they're hemmed in by the desire to push the KYC agenda at every opportunity further into the digital cash space. And we have a direct choice here, which is you can have KYC or you can have financial inclusion, but you can't have both unless somebody will take responsibility for providing identity for everybody that wants it. So we have this situation where we've got multiple imperatives from different actors, but either we solve the identity problem or we relax the KYC requirement or we accept that we're not going to have financial inclusion. And to me, it's that tripod that is the heart of the problem that we see. And it's good that we have solutions kind of at the full reintegration step, but before that, it's a much tougher environment. And I think that that's arbitrary. I think we could fix that relatively easily.
Tristan, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, actually. I think even when we think about what we do now, it's only if you've got the right form of ID still. And that needs to be a form of photo ID issued by a government that's not expired. That excludes a whole group of different people, including asylum seekers in the UK at the moment. The way we think about solving that is by reducing the KYC requirements. So the regulators in the UK are very keen on this as well. And so thinking about offering what's called a basic bank account in the UK and working towards a world where we can walk into a room of totally random people and guarantee to give them all a bank account. And you just limit the bank account to start with. So, for example, we're working with some homeless shelters in the UK, and the aim there is, can we give someone a bank account based upon a handwritten letter from that homeless shelter saying, this is Dave, can you give him a bank account? If we can give him that bank account, we give him a sort code and account number, similar to an IBAN in the UK, and quite low limits to start with, and that's how you get onto that ladder, and then hopefully over time, we can build that up.
I think there's a lot of room for the use of those kind of informal identities with account limits. as on-ramps go, that seems something that kind of squares the circle on, identity and KYC. You sort of compromise on both sides. A little bit of identity, bit of KYC, bit of account limits. Those kind of approaches, I think, have a lot to recommend them because they're compromise solutions. We accept that all these imperatives are there, and then we have trade-offs which are kind of, good enough for current purposes. I quite like that as an approach.
In France, just to give you a very concrete suggestion, there are 3 levels for migrants. You just are asking for shelter, and then you have a receipt for a residence permit, and then you have your residence permit. And we can open accounts for residence permit. It's a great thing. But we wish we could also do it for receipt of residence permit. It would help people earn 3 or 4 months more in their track towards social inclusion. We should just need an MRZ band at the bottom of the file. So if there are any people from the government here, just add this file, MRZ, bond MRZ, at the bottom of it, and it would be a good way for us to check the KYC, just to see it's a reliable piece of paper. Just to give you an example, in Spain, they have what they call the NIE, N-I-E, and it's a chip card. If you're a migrant, you have a chip card with your photograph, and it's very, very trustworthy ID card. So we should, in France, if we can have such reliable identification cards, it would help us to include more migrants in France. And we also talked about language. I know the government is trying to improve the help of French migrants, teaching them French, but language is the first way to include, and even for finance. Because what we realize is that if you don't understand the language, it's a real pain because you receive files and there is a lot of regulation. Recently, we have asked all our customers about, are you a fiscal resident in France or in another country? It's just all about the FATCA regulation system. They just don't understand anything to that, even in France. In France, we're talking about auto-certification form. They just don't understand it. So regulation, language, identification, if we improve that, will help migrants be more integrated in our society.
Do you think the solution to that problem is at the government level with the literacy and that sort of project, or do you think the startups as well have a part to play in terms of
both
multilingual?
Of them. Both. We leverage technologies just to allow residence permit. That's good point. But we have a regulator, and he will ask us, are you reliable enough when you try to identify your customer? And if we just use pieces of paper that are not reliable, we don't do the job regulator asks us to do. So government has a play as he manages the regulators and as he manages the ID papers. If he wants to integrate more migrants, he can use both levels. And I think it's not only oppositing different solutions, it's just being creative of imagining solutions, and they exist as far as you can leverage technology, and you have the right support to identify clearly who you are in front of you, who is in front of you.
Marco, I want to bring you in. One of the topics that came up in the last panel was about listening to refugees and having people on the ground. And as you're building your product, how do you ensure that it's built for your customer and it's built to serve the communities you're trying to serve?
So I would say that we had a weird approach, which was top-down rather than bottom-up. So we saw a need, having had many surveys, focus groups with actual migrants and refugees and people through the journey, so to speak. And we saw one huge gap that we could somehow contribute in filling. That was how you address a completely informal and grey economy, which is huge, and it's preventing welcoming countries from knowing who you are financially, is preventing dignity for people who are moving, and is preventing, I would say, exploitation. No, it's not preventing, it's fostering exploitation through whatever premium services, 7% of charges for deposits. How do you address it? So we said we may need to build a central bank for a decentralized population, which are technically migrants, people who exist across borders, which from a financial standpoint, unless you are extremely wealthy, means that you do not exist. So we went to central banks and said, hey, can you help us figure out how to build a central bank using technologies? And they, oddly enough, they said yes, because I guess, and this, I don't want to be too cynical, but as long as you are touching money that's outside the system, you are not stepping on anyone's toes. And so we teamed up with the evil forces, central banks, and we decided to build something quite new, which is a set of tools that allows people to bank themselves and build their own credit score, their own reputation, only based on the way community works. And then knock on the door of UK friends saying, hey, this is me, this is my money, this is my reputation amongst my community. Do you want me? Yes, no. And so the whole idea is to help them step a little bit up in terms of their negotiation and leverage. When you design such products, it's kind of patronizing to figure out your future customers, because there is no such thing as two migrants with the same struggles, with the same needs, and with the same culture. You cannot group the Philippine community with the Senegalese one. They have completely different values, a completely different way of flowing and working and gathering. What we believe is gonna be the driving force of the future is letting communities build their own tools, and us, more privileged ones, just giving them the tools.
Tristan, there was something you mentioned earlier, and it was about the KYC approach, and you read the regulations and you found that actually the banks, the traditional banks, were applying a higher level of scrutiny than was required. And I'd love to ask you, it really feels like there's been a failure to act on behalf of traditional banks. You're all solving problems that they could have solved. Do you think that there's been a real failure to act here?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's just no incentive for the banks to do it. And it's not even that they're applying a higher standard of KYC, it's that they're applying standards that don't make sense. A big problem is if the address on your driving license doesn't match up with your current home address, but a driving license in the UK lasts for 10 years. And apparently the expectation is that you buy a new driving license every time you move house, which I don't think anybody does. And so nobody's matches up. And that's fine if you're already in the system, but if you're not, then it's impossible. We see the same thing across other communities as well. So we've been doing a lot of work with gambling addicts and trying to build in blocks into their bank accounts to help them stop gambling. And again, this is something that gambling charities have been asking big banks for literally decades. But there's no benefit to big banks. It's not an evil sort of big bank conspiracy, it's just that things move really slowly. If there's no profit incentive and there's no one up at the top pushing it forward, then it will never happen. We're now seeing that start to change, and I think us and many of our competitors as well, focusing on some of these areas and working towards it has meant that we're now starting to see them implement some of these changes, which is really great.
Vinay, last word. You spoke earlier about the problem of the anonymity of traditional cash and the lack of anonymity in the digital world. I'd love to know what your prediction is for where you see this going. Do you think we're going to get to a place where we have anonymous digital cash?
Well, I mean, we already have anonymous digital cash, substantial scale, couple $100 billion in circulation. To me, the question is whether we accept that there will always be an anonymous digital cash economy, or we provide cheap and efficient identity solutions so that you don't have anonymous digital cash, you just take that economy and you onboard people onto some kind of ID platform, or we wind up with long-term structural exclusion. Because if you can't de-anonymize people and give them identities, you either block them from use of the financial system or you accept an anonymous financial system. My preference, given the choice, is I think we should accept anonymous financial systems and then use technologies like AI to look for patterns of activity like money laundering. And at that point, you can do the entire bottom 2 or 3 billion people that are excluded from the systems and don't have hard identities. You can just onboard them directly. And if somebody's doing something like smurfing huge amounts of money around, you ought to be able to pick it up and catch it further up the system. The alternative is that we provide identities for billions of people, and I don't think we know how to manufacture identity at that scale. The problems we've seen with the Indian Aadhaar system are, strong evidence that at least naive approaches are too messy to work. And I think those are it's the horns of a dilemma. Right? We either solve the identity problem, or we accept that the unbanked will bank in illicit ways, or we find some kind of new approach. And AI monitoring of transparent, anonymous digital cash systems, I think, is the cheapest and easiest way of doing it. But this is all wait and see. I'm not a regulator.
Well, there are still 1.5 billion people apparently unbanked around the world. So we've heard a couple of solutions today, a couple of companies working to solve that problem. Can I get a round of applause for the panel?